What's up, guys? Matt with Motorworks here, and in this video today we are going to be replacing the stator. That's right, guys. If you are following along, we are on part 2 of the charging system repair on this BMW G310. Now, in a previous video, I showed you that we got the parts for the bike. It actually took a little bit to get the parts because we had to order an additional gear set. Now, if you're curious as to what that is or what these parts are, I have another video going over these specific parts here, and that video includes the part numbers, and it's actually a good video because from this stator slash clutch setup, starter clutch setup, they have updated those parts. So if you want to see what the changes were on the stator parts, check that video out. Again, this is part 2. We will be replacing the stator. The first thing I do want to show you, however, just like I said in the part 1 video, is I'll show you how to replace the regulator rectifier. Now, the regulator rectifier on this bike is fine and it's working like it should be. I assume. I mean, it might not be. We'll find out at the end of the video, but since it's such an easy part to get to when you have the bike torn down to this level, I'll just show you very quickly how you would replace that at this point in time. Alright, we're on the left side of the bike here, and if you look above the radiator and behind the steering stem here, the regulator rectifier is located. That's this part here with the fins on it. Now, to replace this is a very simple job. Let me get some light on it so you can see. Alright, so there's a better shot of it. If you look here, this is the regulator rectifier. Try and get as close as I can. There's 2 bolts that fasten this to the bike, and they are 5mm Allen bolts. You just loosen these bolts, remove them, and then we'll follow the wiring here. So here's the wiring for it. It comes up, it snakes around. There's 1, 2, 3, and then there'll be a 4th zip tie that fasten these wires down tight. So just remove those 2 bolts, take those zip ties off, and then this regulator rectifier is ready to replace. And then to install it, it's just a reverse of that. So if you had a regulator rectifier issue at this point, when you have the bike tearing apart this far, it is the easier of the 2 jobs. But again, like I said, this seemed to be working fine. Again, I don't have a test for it, so we'll know that it works when I replace the stator and the battery charges. If it doesn't, then we'll also have to replace the regulator rectifier. But that's how you do that. Just wanted to show you guys real quick. Let's get started on removing the stator cover so that we can replace that stator. Alright, so the tools we're going to be using for part 2 of this job: a torque wrench, a 1/2-inch ratchet, a 1/2-inch socket size. This is a 24mm 1/2-inch socket. We'll also need a ratchet, 5mm Allen, as well as a 4mm Allen socket or wrench. An extension if you don't have these nice extended Allens like I do. You'll need an extension because there's some spots that you need a little bit more reach. A 12mm socket. You will need the BMW special tools. Now, I tried to get a link going for the part number. I will again do some searching. I haven't been able to come up with the part number, but if you look here, that's the number written on the tool. So I don't know what you can do with that information, but that's the number written on the top dead center and locating pin. And this is the part number on the actual flywheel puller tool. Again, that's the number on the tool. I don't know if this is a number you can enter into the computer and come up with the part. But you'll need the special flywheel puller tool and the top dead center locating pin. You're also going to need a pair of diagonal cutters. I'm using an electric screw gun. This just makes quick work of this stuff. but you certainly do not need one of those. You'll need some zip ties, brake cleaner, definitely need some Loctite. I have just the blue low grade Loctite, but just low strength Loctite is fine. You don't need anything crazy. And a set of rags. Now when we're reassembling everything, I have these custom made dowel locating pins, and you'll see what these are used for, but all these are just extra long 6x100 bolts that have a really long length to them. I think these are somewhere 90-100 millimeter long bolts, and you'll see why these are useful. But if you can get some of these really long bolts, just cut the head off of the bolt and taper the end of it. And you need 2 of them for this job, but they're just, again, they're a 6x100 bolt that were extra long, and I just cut the head off and tapered the top of the bolt. But those are the tools that we need for this job today. So to remove the stator cover, we're just going to remove this belly pin here, and it's just secured by 4 lock nuts. After we have that off, we'll take off the front sprocket cover, 3 bolts that fasten that on, 1, 2, and the third one's under here. And then we'll take off the stator cover, and that's fastened on by a bunch of 5mm Allen screws as well. And then we will, before pulling this cover off, we'll unclip all the zip ties. I'm going to get my light again here so you can see. So all the zip ties here. So you have zip tie here. You have another zip tie here. And as that wire snakes up through, you just got to follow that wire up through. So that's the wire there. It comes up into this area here and ends here. So there is another zip tie that goes here. We already removed this zip tie in a previous video. So you have 1, 2, 3 zip ties there, and then you will have a 4th zip tie that will fasten it back onto this bracket here. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to remove all these items now, and then we'll go from there. All right, there are 2 things that I missed when I was telling you things you should remove. And the first one is this breather here. You just got to pull this hose off. I didn't undo the clamp. This hose, literally, you can just slide that on with a little effort, and then you can just pull it off again with a little effort. It's not on there super tight, so that just pulls off. And then the other thing is there's an additional plug that plugs into this stator connector. Now you might not have this unplugged. You might have plugged this back in after you were done testing it just to push it off to the side, but if you didn't, I already had the stator wire unplugged. There's just an additional 2-pin there's just an additional 2-pin plug here that needs to be removed as well, and that's this plug here. So took all the zip ties out of the way. You just want to pull that wire through. There shouldn't be anything that really is in the way for removing this. You just want to make sure you get it snaked out. And this is a good time to pay attention how this wire is routed. It's very difficult to see on the video here, but I'll do the best I can to show you. It's actually routed down behind this bracket, behind this bar, and it snakes between, there's a, looks like either an oil feed or a coolant feed line here inside the bike. I'm not sure what it is, but that wire snakes up between that there. You see that brass connector there? The wire sneaks up in between here. So then when you pull that out, you just want to make sure that that sits tight to the frame. It looks like would be the best recommendation for this wire. So we'll just snake that the rest of the way out, and then as it makes its way back here, again it's fastened by this zip tie, and then again it's behind the frame, fastened to another set of wires here, and then it's connected to the actual stator cover at that point. Now, this is going to feel tight. There's a magnet in here. That's what the stator is it sits inside of the flywheel, which is a big magnet. So you're going to need to use a little bit of force to pull this off. You also want to place a rag underneath because there might be some oil in there. Probably not going to be much oil in there, but there might be some. So when you pull this off, you want to pull it as straight off as possible. So just straight out when you're pulling. Now there might be some stuff that falls out of there, gears and stuff, so just be wary of that. But here we have this stator here. It looks like what had happened to this one is, again, just like on the last BMW G310 I worked on, the bolt had backed out on the flywheel and dug into this stator as well. So I'm so glad that BMW has done the update to these bikes and done away with this bolted on style starter clutch, because I think this is going to be a reoccurring issue with these bikes here. There's that bolt backing out and messing up the stator on these bikes. So I'll show you what I mean here in a second. Let me get everything set up and then I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about. All right, so we're going to start with the actual flywheel first. And this is what I'm talking about right here, guys. So the bolts, they loosen up. These bolts here secure the starter clutch to the back of this flywheel. These bolts loosen up, and in this case here, it loosened up enough and backed out to where the stator itself actually broke the head of this bolt off, and as you can see, that bolt's in there broken off. Now this is kind of best case scenario because this really has very minimal copper windings from the actual stator. So this I'd rather see instead of what I saw on the last BMW we had here, where the stator was completely destroyed. There was copper bits throughout the entire engine. If you follow me on Instagram, you saw the picture I posted up with all the metal bits inside the engine and in the oil pan. That thing was a disaster. So this is what happens on these bikes, is what I've been noticing. This is the second one I've had this happen to. So again, the new setup will fix this, but a lot of times this is what's probably going to be the issue if your bike does have a charging system problem, if it has the older style setup. So just showing you guys that now to show you what could potentially happen on your bike. All right, so this next part here is if you have the special tool. Yes, you can just rattle these off with an impact gun. I don't recommend it, but yeah, it can be done. You know, you just put your impact gun on there and just loosen the nut off, and you can get it off that way. I like to use a special tool personally because I have the tool. Now I'm going to try my best to explain how to lock this bike in top dead center position so that you can remove this nut. So if we go over to the right side of the bike, the clutch side of the bike, there is an access hole, which is just covered by this 5mm bolt here. We'll just remove that bolt, and then we'll insert this locking tool into that hole. Now you want to put that the whole way in until it doesn't go anymore. All right. Now there's going to be a couple of false things that you're going to feel. So I'm going to try my best again to explain how to get this thing locked into top dead center position. Right now I just have the crank. It spins freely. So what I'm going to do again is put that tool the whole way in. I'm going to turn the engine over. All right, till it doesn't turn anymore. All right, so what that's doing now, again, we're going to turn the engine over in a counterclockwise rotation. But what I'm doing here is I'm turning that over until it doesn't turn anymore. And what that's telling me is the counterweight on the crankshaft is hitting the tool right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this tool out just a little bit. I might have to loosen this, or I might have to go in the opposite direction just a little bit. I'll pull that tool out maybe a millimeter, and then I'll spin this over again just a hair. Then I'll reinsert that tool. I'll push up and put pressure against it while I'm turning this over. And if you listen, Hear how that's set in there? Now that pin is locked into top dead center on the engine here. And you know that pin's locked in when you try and tighten it and try and loosen it and the engine doesn't turn anymore. So what could happen is you could have it spun over. So we'll spin it over and you could have it stop here. So it could stop in the counterclockwise way with that pin all the way in. And then when you go to spin it the other way, it rotates. That means you haven't gotten that locked into place. So again, you want to make sure that you have it locked in so that it doesn't move either way. All right, so just turn it over. Well, listen, that's locked into place there. Now it doesn't turn this way, and it doesn't turn that way. So again, a little bit of a long-winded explanation, but that's just so you guys get it set up properly and have no issues. Now, you want it to be locked in place because you not only want to loosen this nut, you also want to be able to tighten it down in the future. So make sure you got that set up. Might take a little bit of finesse and figuring it out, but yeah, once you have that locked into place, we can then loosen the nut. Now, this is pretty tight, so you're going to have to put some elbow into it. All right, so once we have that off, we'll just take our flywheel puller and we will back this all the way out the part that applies pressure. We'll just screw that out as far as it goes, and then we'll thread the tool onto the flywheel here. And you want that to grip onto as many threads as you can. And then we'll just tighten the bolt down. That is a 15mm bolt. And we will just tighten this. All right, once that pops, it's pretty much ready to go. You can just pull that straight off, and we will get rid of the flywheel. Again, since we've updated everything here, since the new stuff comes with everything here, we'll just take these gears out, move these pins, all this stuff we will be replacing. So set that off to the side. We'll now have to remove the starter clutch gear as well. Just a 4mm bolt, remove that. Slide that gear off there again, set that off to the side. We don't need that anymore. We're also going to remove, they give you a new keyway here, so we're just going to remove the keyway too. Just get a chisel, knock that keyway out there. So we did get a new one with the kit. We did also get a new nut with the kit as well. So at this point here, what we'll do is we'll just go over with a razor blade or a gasket scraper, and we'll just scrape off any residual gasket material so that the new gasket has a nice clean surface to be on. All right, so here's the stator. We're going to be removing these two bolts here for the ignition pickup. So those are two 4mm Allen bolts there. We're also going to be removing these 3 Allen bolts here that secure the stator to the cover. Only thing you want to be cautious of is this stuff's magnetic, so you know if you have bolts that they want to stick to that, so it might be difficult to take these out. You try and remove them and they'll stick to that magnet. All right, so once we have all those bolts removed, you do want to take note to how the wire is routed from the stator up to where it comes out of the housing here. Just make sure you have that routed the same way. You don't want to pinch that wire between this bracket and the side of the cover here, so just make sure that you route that the same way when you install this. Now to remove it is pretty straightforward. You just want to pull these pieces out, take the wire out of the housing there. It's not held in with anything. We don't use any glues to hold that down. Now what we're going to do is, again, we're going to clean up all these parts here. We're going to scrape the gasket surfaces. I'm not going to bore you with that, but when we come back, everything will be nice, clean, shiny, ready to assemble. One thing to note when you're doing this, especially since that stator was destroyed, we are going to be changing the oil as well as the filter in this bike. Now this one wasn't as bad as the previous one, like I said before, but it is a good idea, since that did have some destruction, to actually go ahead and change the oil in the bike, get all that nastiness that could potentially be in there out. If it's really bad, then I'd recommend pulling off the oil pan and cleaning that out as well, just like I did previous. But this one wasn't so bad. It looks like this one we caught kind of early, and it didn't destroy as much. All right, so one thing that happened when this came apart is this little breather, I don't know what you want to call it. It's just kind of a bypass. This is a breather connected to a balance shaft on the bike, and it goes out of there, goes through this little piece here, and then ends on this side of the bike here in this cover. Now, what I have seen on these is this seal sometimes gets torn during assembly. I think it has happened. But you just want to check, make sure that this seal isn't torn before you put this all back together. And you want to make sure that you have this installed correctly. Now, to install it correctly, there's a little nub here on the bottom, and that's going to line up. You'll see there's a little cutout. Here, I'll just show you. There's a little cutout right here where that nub there sets inside of there. And when you reinstall this, you just want to be careful that you don't nick that seal. So just be very cautious when you're putting this on. Don't force it. It should slide on relatively easily without too much of an issue. So got that in there. That's on. Alrighty, so now we have the cover cleaned up. All the gasket material is removed, and we got any there were some pieces of the old stator in here, so we just made sure I cleaned all that stuff out. Just if you do have that issue, make sure you clean everything out very well and then clean it again. You're never going to clean this stuff too much, so just make sure you got all the debris, if any, out of there and all the gasket material removed. All right, so we're going to install the stator. Now again, just like I said before, you want to be careful how you route these wires, because if you pinch these wires, the stator will not work, or you may also have trouble getting it to start because the ignition pickup is also inside that housing, and those are also wires that are fed through. So I'm just going to hook this up. One other precaution, if you will, use Loctite on all the fasteners that are inside this cover. The last thing you want to have happen is have a bolt back out. And I'm only using blue Loctite, so it's not super strong Loctite. It's just something as an added protection. I wouldn't recommend using red Loctite, but a good blue Loctite, something low strength, will work just fine. All right, now before we bolt this down, we want to make sure that we have the wire routed correctly from the stator up, and this wire should go between these two bolt holes there. The two bolt holes that mount the ignition pickup. That wire should fish right through there. Hopefully this is picking up on camera. I believe it is, but that wire right there. All right, then we'll just line up the screw holes that line up with that position there. Make sure that that's down in and flush. All right, so you hear how that click down in. It's nice and flush now. You can start our bolts. As always, I recommend to start bolts hand tight. All right, so we're going to tighten this down. Just snug tight. You want to make these tight. I will put a torque spec up here. It's going to be relatively low, so somewhere in the 9 to 10 foot-pound range. I got to find the exact number, but for me, if you just make these tight, and with that Loctite on there, these aren't special stretch bolts or anything like that, so just make them all snug. After that's tight and that wire is routed properly, we'll then come up here and mount the ignition pickup. Now again, you want to make sure that you route the wire correctly behind the ignition pickup so that you don't pinch that wire when you put this on. See this little tab here, if you don't have this wire mounted correctly, this little tab here will dig into that wire and you could have electrical issues. It might not show up right away, but it could be something down the road where the bike may be losing an ignition signal or might have a charging issue again. It's routed the right way there. It's behind this tab, and that tab's not sticking into the wire at all. So that's how you want to route that there. Now that we have that routed correctly, we can now attach our ignition pickup. Now this does have small recesses on it, so there are small little grooves on the back side of these mounting tabs here that actually fit inside the the holder, and you want to make sure that you have this set in there and recessed in there, and you don't kink those over, because that's actually what's locating this ignition pickup so that it works properly. So don't have it off to the side or kinked when you're putting it together. Make sure it's sitting in there and it's nice and flush before you start to tighten those bolts. Alright, so we also want to make sure that we put Loctite on those bolts. Doesn't have to be a crazy amount of Loctite, just enough that these bolts don't run the chance of backing out. Again, before you tighten everything down, you want to make sure your wire is still in the right location so it doesn't get pinched. Again, another low torque. I will have the torque spec on these. These are probably no more than 8 foot-pounds if I remember correctly. Again, I will have the correct spec, but for now they're just a really light. I'm not applying a lot. As you can see, I'm gripping the top of the ratchet, so it's just very low torque on those. Alright, so this is all assembled. What we now need to assemble is the engine. The very first thing we need to do is put the new keyway onto the crank, and we did get a keyway with this kit. Now, if you order the kit that I had told you about in the last upload, then you would have gotten a keyway with it. If all you ordered was just a stator, because you have the updated clutch setup already in it, starter clutch setup, then you probably won't need to do this part specifically. But if you're updating, which we are doing, and you're replacing that flywheel, it does come with a new keyway, so I'm just going to install the new keyway. And pretty much you just set that in place just like that, and that keyway is replaced. Alrighty, so now we're going to assemble the starter clutch. Now, in a previous video where I showed you how to do the starter clutch, it was with the older style clutch setup, and for that it was just easy to leave this part on the bike and put the new starter clutch assembly onto the bike with this gear in place. This new starter clutch setup is a little bit different, and it's a little bit more difficult to get this assembly put together. So I'm going to struggle through this. I haven't found an easy way to do this yet, because this is literally the second or third time I've done this new style clutch setup. So the main issue that you run into with this is all those one-way clutches, if you want to call them, these bearings, whatever you want to call those, they all are individually by themselves, basically. So I can take each one of these out by itself. So the issue is, when you try to put this in, these want to push down and out of where they're being held. So it is a little frustrating. What I found is if you kind of start at a slight angle and turn it counterclockwise, that kind of pushes those clutches back into their housing a little more, and then you can kind of work it around. So just start at a little bit of an angle, and I'm probably going to mess this one up a couple times before I get it right. This is, honestly, this is probably the most frustrating part of this whole job, is getting this new starter clutch assembly together. But, you know, take your time, just like I did there. You know, go kind of one bearing at a time, remembering to turn it counterclockwise so it pushes that bearing back into the spring socket and actually holds it in place as you work it around. So that's in, that's assembled. We can now put this back on the bike. So when you're installing this flywheel, you want to make sure that you're holding that gear together. You don't want this to come apart at this point because you have an opening, and if you lose one of those one-way bearings and it falls into the engine, you're going to have to take the oil pan off, and that's just going to add to the headache of your day. All right, so when you're installing this, hold on to the back of this as long as you can. All right, now when you install it, there is a notch for where the keyway is, so just make sure you line the keyway up with that notch. And again, hold on to the back of the clutch, or hold on to that gear as long as you can while you're putting that in there. Eventually you'll get it on and it'll just hold itself in place and you'll be fine, but just make sure that you hold on to that the whole time, so that way your starter clutch doesn't come apart. All right, now again, we need some more Loctite right here on the threads of the crank. Again, I'm not using super strong Loctite here, just making sure that stuff does not come apart. The kit came with a new nut, so again, if you've ordered this kit, you get a new nut and a new keyway. So just put nut on there, and we will torque this. I do have the torque wrench for this, and this is around 80 foot-pounds, so we will torque this down. All right, now we do have the pin still holding the crank in top dead center position. Don't be afraid to torque these down with that pin in. I've done several of these bikes now, over 10 at least, and every one I've torqued down with that pin in there. That's what I believe it's designed to do, is hold that in place. If I'm wrong, drop a comment below, but I've had luck with it. It hasn't broken yet. All right, so now that this is torqued on there, make sure that everything still springs freely. You want to make sure that you got everything together and nothing's binding. Then we will take the gear holder, I guess you would call it. Not exactly sure what they refer to this part as, but this is the gear holder here. And again, Loctite is your friend. In this situation, anytime you're putting something together inside an engine, I recommend putting a little Loctite on it, unless it's part of the rotating assembly, like the crank or you know, connecting rods, stuff like that. I don't recommend putting Loctite on, but stuff like this where these things can back out, you know, connecting rods, head bolts, stuff like that. Typically, that stuff is torque to yield, so that stuff is stretch bolts, and it's designed to kind of not need Loctite. But things like this, you need Loctite on. Loctite's mainly going to do the job on that one there, because that one's really low torque. All right. So your little holder's reinstalled. Now we can start to reassemble our gear sets here. First one you want to put on is this plain gear here. This one is what connects the starter gear. It's just kind of an intermediate gear. And the reason you want to put that one on first is because you can then line this one up easier. So this one has two gears, a smaller and a larger gear. The smaller diameter gear goes toward the engine case, and the larger diameter toward the outside of the case. And then we'll just move that gear until we get it in a right position to line up the starter and the intermediate gear together. Good, that's in. That's all the way back as far as it'll go. It's not going to be binding on the other gear. That's all set up good. So you want to make sure that these pins are in the whole way and bottomed out. That's good to go. All right, now before we assemble this, we want to make sure we put our dowel pins in. So one goes here. Make sure you have both of these. And the second one goes down here. And then just a little crack in the case. It's not a crack in the case, it's where the case halves come together. What you want to do here is just put a little bit of silicone or just a little bit of sealant there. All right, so just a little bit on your finger and just touch it to that case. Just a little bit. It's all it takes, just a little dab there. And then that will keep it from leaking between those two case halves there. There's only one spot where those two come together and a gasket is. So that's, just make sure you put a little bit of sealant on there. All right, now the reason I put these dowel pins in on the case and not on the actual covers because it holds the gasket on there better. Now what we're going to do is grab two of those studs. All right, so this is where these studs that I talked about come in handy. So we'll just put them one here, and then we'll put the other one on the other side. You don't want to go crazy with them. You still want to be able to remove them after you install them. So don't thread them in the whole way. But you just want to put these two studs in here, and what this is going to do is help guide that cover on, because this is a magnet and that's attracted to this magnet, the stator is, so it's going to want to suck that case on, and you just don't want it to kink sideways, cock sideways when you're doing that. So that's what the nice thing about these studs are. It helps guide that all on. Now before we put this on, again, you just don't want to be frustrated. You have to line up quite a few things. These pins have to line up. These dowel pins also have to line up. So there's a lot of stuff that needs to line up. Just take your time putting this cover on. Again, it's going to want to suck this in, so get all the wires out of the way. Keep your fingers off to the side so you don't get them pinched between the case cover there. But just guide that in. And there's guide pins there, and go as straight as possible back onto the engine. Just like that. Wires are out of the way. We can remove these studs because, again, this is magnetized, so it's going to hold that cover on. As soon as it is set in place, you can take these bolts out. The other nice thing about these is it keeps that gasket from slipping up and down, you know, in addition to the dowel pins. So that just makes quick work of that. All right, now I didn't label any of these bolts that hold this cover on because they're all the same length. The only bolts that are different length are the ones that go over the sprocket cover. These bolts here are slightly shorter than these bolts here, but I leave them in the sprocket cover, and that way I don't get confused. But yeah, these should all be the same length. And we'll tighten everything down. Torque spec again, relatively low, about 8-10 foot-pounds. That's tight. We can pull our hose back down here and reattach it to the breather vent. Just like that. And now we're just going to reroute this wire back up through. And once we do that, we'll then check the charging system. Alrighty, so I have everything wired up. All the stuff's connected. It's loosely on there right now. The reason for that being is I want to check to make sure the charging system is working before we go ahead and button everything back up. All right, so we'll go around here. I put a little dot on all the places where the zip tie goes when you put this back together. So there, there, then the zip tie here, 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 and that's it for the zip ties. Right, so now I'm going to reassemble the bike. Time me on that. Wait, stop the clock, stop the clock. Was one zip tie I forgot to mention. when you put the ECU back on, there is a zip tie that fastens this wire. Zip tie lives matter, people. I just keep getting faster and faster on putting these things together. But that is going to do it for this video, guys. That is how you replace the stator. That is how you diagnose the charging system. If you have any other questions concerning, stuff in this video, you want to go in a little bit more detail, I certainly can do that. But that is going to do it for this video. If the video was helpful, guys, as always, give it a thumbs up. Thank you for liking, commenting, and subscribing, and we'll see you in the next video.